risk thinking. And I'd like to start by introducing our distinguished panel and then asking them to come and join me on the stage. First of all, Joe Rippon, Head of Financial Structuring at Sizewell C. Cristina Martinez Garcia, Group Chief Risk Officer for SACYR, who will be joining us virtually from Spain. I'm sure she'll appear on the screen behind me imminently. Nick Faull, Head of Climate and Sustainability Risk at Marsh. Cvete Koneska, Head of Advisory at Dragonfly, and John Scott, Head of Sustainability Risk at Zurich Insurance Group. If I could ask you to come and join me, please. Welcome, Cristina. We can see you now. Can you see us?
Hi, everyone.
Good, excellent. Can I start then by asking Cvete to kick us off with a perspective on the geopolitical landscape and how the war in Ukraine and other factors are exacerbating our energy crisis and how we think about ESG.
Absolutely, and good morning, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here and speak to you all this morning. It's a room full of risk professionals, risk managers, so I guess it will come as no news to you that the landscape in which we are operating today is a little bit challenging when we look at the geopolitical, the economic, the energy situation. Our businesses and organizations in general have found 2022 quite challenging. So looking ahead, we're bracing ourselves for what's going to be quite a challenging year. Trying to zoom in on a few things and a few factors that I think are going to be driving how we think about risk, and in particular ESG issues in the coming year. It'll come as no news to you, but here are the three things that I think will shape the context as to how we think about ESG and climate change in the coming year. At the top of the list, I would put geopolitical tensions. Geopolitical tensions and the kind of logical consequence of that, which is the deglobalization internationally. The reason I see this as one of the top risk drivers for ESG, well, it's because, climate change is global. It's a global problem. And if the global order is not working, if we have a failure to collaborate, if we have growing conflict, as we do, then the context for coming up with solutions, coming up with products for sustainability and climate change is just going to be so much more challenging in coming months. Just to pick the two probably key drivers of geopolitical tensions, the war in Russia and the kind of resulting economic sanctions, as we say, economic almost warfare between the West and Russia on one side, and then the perhaps not so overt but nonetheless equally impactful tensions in Asia, between China, again Taiwan, and what that means for relations between China and the West. And these two factors aren't about to disappear in 2023. If anything, they'll probably escalate. And the fact that some of the biggest international actors are involved in those and are going to be put in a position to find solutions, overcome their tensions when it comes to global climate issues, well, that is going to be one thing that risk professional businesses, organizations in general are going to have to think and plan for when thinking about ESG in coming months. Now, I can talk a lot more about what the actual specific implications might be for different sectors, different organizations, what this means for multilateral institutions who also need to operate in this global context, who are also coming up with normative and legislative frameworks for ESG, whether it's reporting, whether it's UN standards, and so on. So all of these are going to be impacted by the growing geopolitical tensions. Moving on to the second risk driver I'd like to raise is, again, not going to be a very big surprise, but the economic downturn. globally, in particular also in Europe, where we are seeing particularly challenging confluence of economic difficulties for governments that have oftentimes drained public finance as a result of several years of pandemic spending and support. For populations, again, who will be struggling economically, for businesses, as we see there's a lot of layoffs, there's a lot of fear in the markets. And all of this only adds to the difficult and challenging context for ESG. And I think it will be very interesting for us as risk professionals, and this is what we are also doing, to see how ESG comes out of these challenging times. It's a little bit like a test for governments, for companies, how firm their commitments are, whether financial, normative, or otherwise, to climate change and ESG issues in times of economic difficulties. Some difficult choices and trade-offs may need to be made, and it will be interesting to see who comes up and comes out of this where on issues of climate change. It's very easy to make commitments to net zero during good economic times, but I think now we're looking at, as I said, some difficult choices to be made. And finally, the third point I'd like to raise as a key risk driver is the energy crisis. Again, all of these are related. I would actually argue that the economic crisis has geopolitical roots, as does the energy crisis. So really understanding the geopolitical drivers of all of these is key. Nonetheless, they'll have different implications. So I'd like to spend the last minute talking about the energy crisis. It is very interesting to have followed, I guess, the conversations in our sector in risk on the issues of energy crisis, energy shortages in Europe in particular, and what that might mean for climate change. Many were encouraged that this is a moment of opportunity. This is the moment where Europe, Western markets would kind of pivot and accelerate investment into renewable energy, into clean energy, and transition to net zero. And that is certainly a big, big opportunity. We're yet to see how that pans out, largely also because despite potentially the very good intentions of governments and organizations, there are some structural constraints as to how much can be achieved and how quickly can be achieved. We've seen this with attempts to replace Russian gas imports through LNG. There's only so much LNG infrastructure that's available in Europe, and it takes a while to build it. And similarly with other clean energy generation technologies, simply the time is such that I think in the shorter term, potentially we're going to see a step back and a reversal to some of the clean energy commitments by governments, potentially delaying closures of coal mines and other dirtier fuels, just in order to get through the winter, in order to ensure that populations have energy, they have heating and so on. So while the overall trajectory, I hope, and I think we really should see a pivot towards cleaner renewable energy, in the shorter term we may be looking at a risk of kind of increased continued reliance on fossil and dirtier fuels. I will stop there, but I would not like necessarily to only offer you doom and gloom overview. So I would also say there's a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of opportunities even when thinking about risk in ESG. I think in times of economic crisis, there's always opportunities to innovate. And I think one of my colleagues will speak more about innovation and technology, but a good crisis should never really go to waste. And there are entrepreneurs and disruptors out there working on clean technologies as well. It should also potentially be an opportunity for companies, for businesses who are going through tough economic times, tough time in the market, to think about the values. It's always through difficulty that your values are really distilled. So when I say how we come out on our ESG and sustainability commitments out of this economic crisis, it's a good point to stop and think what it is that really matters to us as an organization, what our values are, and proceed with that. So hopefully at the end of this dark and economically difficult time, we will have few more organizations who are clear about their purpose and values. And that may be one of the other opportunities that we might look at from this. But I will stop there, hand back to Stephen, and looking forward to the conversation afterwards.
Thank you very much indeed, Cvete. And can I just build with a question, build on that with a question around where we think we are today as we consider specifically the climate crisis and the steps that are being taken to prevent catastrophic tipping points being reached, and how do you see, if that's the global context for us, what's the context that you're seeing for progress against achieving 1.5%? Can I start with you, Cristina? Can I pass that question first to you?
Hi there, everyone. Apologies, I had race committee clashing with the event, so sorry for any inconvenience. So back to your question. Let me start by reflecting on, I would say, a general, thought in the business community. ESG shouldn't be a surprise to us. Today is ESG. Tomorrow it will be ABC, the day after tomorrow it will be XYZ, and the day after that is another TLA. So what's TLA? It's another 3-letter acronym. And I don't mean to be rude, as you know, this event is around ESG. But I just wanted to emphasize that as a Chief Risk Officer, no matter which acronym is on the horizon, what makes a good risk management system is how deeply it is tied to business goal realization. So alongside ESG issues, there exists a vast and growing array of, for example, technological issues, emerging risks and opportunities. So I'm saying this because we are living in a world continually bombarded by, serious environmental, social and governance issues. And it is a world that it is finally waking up to the notion that environmental, social and governance issues are critically important to any organization's strategy, resilience and long-term viability, whether it is a business, a non-profit, an educational institution, a government entity, or even a nation. So while the recognition of all this ESG is finally happening, there's no time to waste to add more acronyms to include this vast and growing array of technology, digital issues, and geopolitical risks and other opportunities. So this is basically a reflection that comes to my mind whenever there's a conversation around ESG, and I think it's important to consider ESG not as a new concept. It's true that metrics around environmental, social, and corporate governance criteria, are currently essential for any organization to evaluate their biggest exposures in this increasingly intangible environment. So I would argue that ESG is much more than about sustainability. It is about assigning value to intangible assets, and it has been picking up for decades. So capital providers, including for example, insurance companies, of course, naturally want to know more about the biggest values at risk. And that's where ESG metrics, for example, play a role. And these can help us to evaluate potential risks to corporate reputation, for instance. So in the face of these big operational disruptions, let me simply share my, this insight, which is capital providers, consumers want to know if we companies are actually assessing the impact of those risks that we have.
Great, thank you. And perhaps, John, if I can ask you in that context, what do you see the role for corporates, for companies that Christina's talking about? And how do you think that is changing with regulatory demands, I guess consumer sentiment shifts as well? What's your assessment of corporate readiness to deal with this?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just come back on the ESG thing. So ESG, the history of it is essentially an investment tool. And that's fine if you're an insurer, because one side of our balance sheet, very important part, is asset management. It's the other side to the liabilities we take onto our balance sheet, which is essentially the risks we take on or transfer from all your balance sheets when you buy insurance. So the point is, as an investor, for a long time, for over 20 years, there's been a data-driven approach, and therein lies another huge issue about the quality of the data, of ESG data, because it's all different and it doesn't really match from different providers. So you use this ESG data to essentially underweight and overweight your portfolio in certain, according to these certain ESG metrics. Now, that's a big difference from what's called impact investing, where actually you try to understand what's the consequences of your investing. So the whole ESG construct is a little bit challenging, because whilst broadly you might think, oh, well, we're more or less allocating our capital to companies, or actually broaden that to outside of companies to sovereigns, just where is the good stuff happening? And are you really trading off and still supporting so-called bad stuff when you try and do the good stuff? So I think the whole ESG construct is a little bit challenging. And I much prefer to talk about sustainability more broadly, because as I was just saying, it covers many more broader topics. So if you're a risk manager in a corporate and you're concerned about some of the geopolitical or economic impacts of what's going on in the world at the moment, as Cvete was pointing out, you're also interested in what's going on societally, whereas the demand for some of your products, given consumer behaviour changes because of what's going on societally, and you'll also be really interested in what's going on technologically. And of course, environment, especially if you're, almost in any industry, you'll be feeling the transition risks in some way, shape or form, either in your company or in your supplier base or in your customers. And certainly the physical risks of climate change we're beginning to see already. Sea level rise because of land ice melt, greater levels of storm surge flooding, these kinds of things, and wildfires, increased levels of drought and so on. So all of these things we need to be aware of and think about. And I think so the challenge for corporates is, you're a little bit constrained about what you do. There's only just a set range of things you can influence as a company. And I think in sustainability risk, we're very comfortable now with this concept of double materiality, a phrase coined by the EU Sustainable Finance Action Plan and the Sustainable Finance Taxonomy, where we're trying to think about risks that are inside out. So traditionally, as companies often, companies have talked about sustainability. They say, look, we want to be a 1.5 degree centigrade company. We want to, drive a world which achieves the 1.5 degree or net zero goals. Well, fine, that's over a 30-year time horizon. So what are you actually doing? What actions are you actually taking right now that is driving that? So I think there's a lot of risk with greenwashing, and that's very familiar to people at the moment, and so-called green hushing, where people are so scared to say anything about it because of litigation that they don't say anything anymore. So I think there's all those kind of challenges on the inside-out risks. The outside-in risks, which are the classic thing, if any of you have done a scenario-based climate risk assessment in your company, you'll have had to consider the changes, the sort of transition risk, the physical risk, how those impact your business in all different dimensions. And that's a massively challenging task, because actually typically when you do these kind of analyses, they're over really long time periods, well outside your normal planning horizon of maybe 1 to 3 years. They're out decades. I'm not going to be around in 30 years' time, probably. I'm quite old now. And I hope I can hand over the baton to all of you, to sort of all you young people out there, to really drive all these changes that need to happen. But I think, so these are the kind of challenges of corporates, is that, what is it that you can look at in terms of the inside-out risk and the outside-in risk that actually makes change actually happen in the real world? And finally, I'm just going to finish on this, is that it can't just be corporates on their own, and especially in the finance sector. I think there's three big actors here. There's essentially the financial actors who, you all have heard of GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and there's a number of sub-alliances for banking, asset managers, asset owners, insurers, or the insurance sector, so that includes brokers and so on. And that's important to get the finance sector allocating capital to the appropriate projects to drive change, whether it's in climate or societal issues or indeed influencing people about their company governance. But that can't be just done on its own. Obviously, the changes, especially with climate, has to happen in the real economy, and in particular in the carbon-intensive sectors. And I'm sorry to bang on about this. I used to work in the oil and gas industry for a decade in my early part of my career. But fundamentally, we have to decline. All scenarios that get us to net zero talk about a significant decline in oil and gas, and certainly thermal coal. Thermal coal by 2040, oil and gas certainly oil down to about 20% of current production volumes. That's not about, by the way, saying, stop oil and gluing yourself to your chair. You need to go home this evening, so, don't glue yourself to your chair and protest like that, please. But, the point is that you can't just do it by supply constraint. That's what's happened in the last 12 months with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent sanctions against Russia, and then the weaponization of energy supplies to Europe. That we've artificially, by sanctions, shut off about 20% of the global energy supply. That's just extraordinarily painful for everyone. It just adds to commodity price inflation. It affects food, it affects energy, it affects the broader cost of living crisis and broader inflation, which, by the way, then runs into all sorts of issues around debt and corporate and private debt and how that's going to run off. So the finance sector can just do so much. The carbon-intensive sectors have to do a lot, and it's not just oil, it's also about changing fossil fuel demand. So it's any of you who work in an industry which uses lots of fossil fuel, whether that's in power generation, transportation, iron and steel, cement, petrochemicals, agrochemicals, or agriculture more broadly, you've got to have a transition plan to change things. Otherwise, we're not going to decline that oil demand and decline the oil supply over the next 30 years.
Fantastic. Thank you. Can I go on to if that's all right? Thank you, John. Sure. And can I ask, just building on that, Nick? Cvete sort of described it as a moment of opportunity, and John talked about some of the things that actually need to happen. What's your sense of what needs to be true for the current crisis to help accelerate a just energy transition?
I think it is accelerating a just energy transition. I think one of the positive things that has come out of what's been going on for the last year is that there has been a demonstrable acceleration in ambitions to build low carbon power and energy sources. And I think for me that's very important, because really that should have been happening anyway. All the countries that are now making these big scale announcements, they all have net zero obligations by 2050, and they were not moving quickly enough to get there. So it should have been happening anyway. It's proven how quickly things can move and change if there is a will to do it. I think the other positive thing for me that's come out of it is people now have a much greater appreciation of what an expensive energy system is actually like. So in my industry, in my business, I have to, we work with endless repetitions of power market models going out to 2050, doing cost of the energy system and decarbonisation, and people have arguments about whether it's affordable or not. Now we really know what an unaffordable energy system is, and I can tell you that the cost of decarbonisation are significantly lower. And then the final positive that I would bring out of what is happening today is I think the level of public engagement with the energy sector is much higher than it was before. We're all aware, certainly the people I talk to, are far more aware of how much energy they're consuming, what they can do to reduce energy use. And they are also very aware that a solution or a mitigant of the current situation would have been if we had decarbonised faster. Very positive things.
Great, thank you. Joe, can I ask you, we talked around commitments by corporates, and I wonder what your view is on how to take boards from being engaged with the issue to being fully committed to it, and whether there are changes in corporate governance that may be required about that. So what does that process feel like from your perspective?
So I'm Nick, and Joe's on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem at all. No problem at all. So can I just maybe before addressing that, just pick up on one of the points that that John was talking about. So, and in fact, Stephen, you made reference to the COP27 conference that's taking place in Egypt at the moment, where countries are going to try and recommit and even extend to their carbon emission reductions. And the reality is that that's still not likely to be able to get us to 1.5. And that's going to give rise, of course, as we've heard, to the kind of sort of physical risk that we're already beginning to see, and we're going to see a lot more of in the coming years and decades. But one of the challenges with climate change is that the physical risks, although we're experiencing them today, the really bad stuff is likely to hit us in the future. John talked about the sort of 30-year scenarios. One of the other risks that I think we're going to see a lot more about in the coming years is nature-related risk, which we haven't really talked about yet. And the thing with nature-related risks, I think these are the risks that are actually going to affect us now and over the next few years. So just to give you a couple of examples, almond farmers in California depend on bees for pollination. There is currently such a reduction in the number of bees. There are bee thefts from farm to farm. So it's already impacting them there. Yeah, okay, fine, that's agriculture. I can see how nature impacts that. But actually, there's a Taiwanese chip manufacturer heavily dependent on water. They are currently having to truck in water because the level of their reservoirs is so low. So a sector you wouldn't immediately think associated with nature already being impacted. And I think as these kind of risks become more well known, and we have the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is going to be coming into force sort of along the same lines as the TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. That's going to come onto corporate radar. So I guess that sort of indirectly, at least, addresses your question. I think these are the kinds of things that are going to engage boards and companies because it's going to impact them now.
And can I ask just a really quick final question of each of you? What areas of hope do you see on the horizon? Can I start, Cristina, with you?
Okay. I would probably highlight that sustainability is now, a central tenet of the COVID recovery. I think ESG funds continue to outperform, driving, retail appetite. Global standards for ESG reporting for corporates is accelerating uptake, and we can see dramatic improvements in data quality and availability.
Fantastic, thank you. Could I go to Joe in that case?
Okay. Right.
We'll get to
3 points. I think the need to achieve a successful transition has never been higher on the public and political consciousness, and I think that that has not been driven by a worsening of the prognosis. It's just an increase in awareness. The other positive I would say is there is an enormous amount of effort and time being put into developing strategies and ways to do that. And I think what we can see is the technological solutions are available or are close, and as I said earlier, are affordable. And then my final reason for hope is we have human ingenuity, which is a proven force for successfully dealing with challenges. Look at how quickly we got through COVID. And
wonderful, thank you. John, where do you find hope?
I think in the energy crisis, and it's just as you're saying, it spurs people to make things change. And so I think we have a chance for an optimistic path for a cleaner and greener energy system in the world that's more resilient.
Fantastic, thank you. Nick?
So I think we all agree that the pace of change in terms of moving to net zero has been slower than we hope, but actually the pace of technology innovation has been much faster. So I think that's our major reason for hope. A couple of examples, sustainable fuel, so SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, biomethanol to power ships. Both of these can be produced from waste. There is now technology that enables us to create these kinds of fuels from waste. 10 tons of carbon waste produces 1 ton of bioethanol, and effectively an unlimited source of waste. And secondly, carbon capture and storage currently costs about $300 to $400 per ton. It will, in the near future, probably come down to about 100 to 150. Carbon costs about $20 per ton now. It doesn't take a huge stretch of the imagination to see that those are going to become very commercially viable in the near future.
Fantastic, thank you. Cvete, some final thoughts on
Final
hope.
thoughts. So, well, two areas of hope that I see. First, I think hopefully we'll see more unity come from adversity. Like in other periods historically where there was a lot of conflict and political and security tensions, a more unified world hopefully emerges. And I hope we see that ultimately countries, governments, organizations need to collaborate to solve conflict, political or otherwise, but also climate issues. So I do hope this is a period of adversity that leads us to the greater unity. And the second area of potential hope I see is that a growing potentially understanding in talking to politicians, to people in business, that actually energy security coincides or lies in the same kind of area as renewable energy, as clean energy. So that understanding that these two big aims and objectives of governments, to ensure energy of security supply, to diversify imports and so on, are actually the solution to that, lies in the same space as obtaining clean energy and transitioning to clean energy. So that's my last thought.
Thank you very much indeed, and I'd like to thank all of the panel for a really fascinating start to the day. Thank you very much indeed. Do we have time? How long do we have? How long do we have, Dan?
Question. So we've got a microphone. Helen, I think you've got one somewhere. Have you got a microphone down there? Right. If people want to raise their hands.
Chris, I think you.
We probably don't need a microphone. Actually, sorry, we do, because people are watching online, so they won't hear the question without the microphone. So sorry. Just be patient. Hopefully, the one will be coming very shortly. Sorry about this. Here we go.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Chris Blockley-Webb, Ministry of Defence. There are no electric charging points for tanks on battlefields, just out of interest. I'll just put that out there. As risk managers and risk professionals, everything that you've said this morning makes perfect sense. I'd just like to put a question to the panel, really, generically, and to everybody in the room. If you look back 5 years and look forward 5 years, are we at a pivot point where we have to understand globally, if we talk about globally, the way our belief systems are set? Now, what do I mean by that? Think Indo-Asia Pac, China, Russia. Their belief systems, socio-political, are very, very different to the democratic of the West. Their ultimate gains and ultimate goals, certainly from a communist perspective, are long, drawn-out, almost chess-like in the political sphere. Climate change and ESG in the West changes almost in 24 hours. I'll give Jacob Rees-Mogg as a really good example. From a macro to a micro, we went from, you can't do that, you can't do that. 24 hours later, we're going to be fracking the hell out of the United Kingdom. As risk managers, have we not got to reset our thinking to be thinking as our colleagues in other areas of the world think. So we've got to be far more strategic. We've got to be thinking about their long-term goals and what that means, winding it back into the here and now. So why is Russia, why are Putin, why are they doing what he's doing? Where are the Chinese positioning themselves in the last 12 hours with what was described as a wonderful meeting between Xi Jinping and Biden, and there will be no more trade wars? In 2 years' time, we may find Trump back in the White House. So we've got to change our thinking. How do we as risk managers, and how do we then define that between horizon scanning, I love that phrase, and emerging risks? And then how do we manage and provide options that are viable rather than turning the page of the Daily Mail every time we sit down for breakfast in the morning, which seems to be happening in the Western democratic sphere, and which feeds into socio-economic, which feeds into energy requirements. Because everything I've heard this morning is around the Western democratic construct, which I think, if we were to be honest, is fragile at the moment at best. And we've seen that just by the way we are couching and looking at Russia and China. Thank you.
Great question. Who'd like to start with a response to that?
I can take it. Yeah.
I'll
Yes,
have a go
John,
to start.
have a go.
So I think your characterisation is correct in terms of the long-term view of some autocratic leadership in different countries around the world. I wouldn't characterise it as old-school thinking of it's communism versus Western capitalism, because I think that kind of thinking leads you down a path of thinking, well, okay, it's just us versus them. It's not like that at all. It's infinitely more complicated because, as we've seen with somewhat, I think, as mentioned it as deglobalization, it's the failure of multilateralism. And the challenge with a lot of these big global risks like climate is they require multilateral, or at least many actors working in concert in some sort of way. But we live in a world which is more transactional, it's more regional, it's more bilateral in its agreements between countries. So you gave the example with Biden meeting Xi. And that just happens to be the two most powerful or biggest economies in the world. So what they do is extremely important. But I think this thing about long-term and short-term is important, and especially when it comes to things like the energy sector, where governments really should be setting, or in many countries, setting an environment or a structure whereby the governance of electricity generation or power generation is stable over a long period of time. I mean, I was asked to be part of the Green Finance Task Force in 2015 by the UK government. Out of that was supposed to fall the UK industrial strategy and energy strategy. That appeared, and then it's changed 3 times, to your point, since then. So that's no good. We've got to have a stable approach to energy systems. And by the way, it's about building resilience. So it's not like plumping for just green. It means, what does green mean? You can't just have, if you just rely on one source of power, you're in big trouble. I mean, you guys know that extremely well in the energy industry. So it's about diversification of energy resources. And I think, the military are brilliant at that, aren't they? Because if you go to the battlefield today, correct, there aren't, as far as I know, electric tanks yet. But for sure, you'll find, field sort of command centres where they've rolled out a big mat of solar panels to power up their communications. So, even the military, well, especially the military, who work on resilience and being prepared and all the rest of it, I think they're exemplars of how it should work. But I'm optimistic about the world. I think we can drive these long-term commitments, but it means a lot of hard work, and it means, to my earlier points, it means working not only in finance, not only in the real economy, but with governments as well, and in particular holding governments to account, which is your point, on their commitments, often enshrined in legislation.
Cvete.
I just a quick remark. I think it's obviously a fantastic question. I wish I had a ready answer for it, but I don't. But what I can say, well, first is that I think in any given point, not just now, I think now perhaps these needs are more obvious, but at any given point, it makes sense to understand what drives different actors, your different stakeholders, whether they sit here in the West or whether they sit elsewhere and are driven by a completely different set of values and objectives. And for us to be a little bit more flexible in thinking about, what drives different people. I've read so much, and I'm sure all of you hear about, irrational decision-making by Putin in Russia and so on. There are assumptions about rationality and what makes and doesn't make sense to other actors. We need to put that to one side when we think about the world. And I think as risk managers, a lot of us do that. It's just expanding in that thinking, kind of embedding it deeper within your assumptions for your risk models and so on, and not being limited by it, because that's where your blind spots are, when your assumptions don't really hold true universally. And we are all, I admit myself, often victims to that, assuming my rationality will apply to whether it's Russian actors or Chinese or anywhere else in the world. A final minor point to the conversation about the military. I think there's a lot of opportunity when thinking about defense, and I was recently speaking to a media outlet about this. I think so much of R&D budgets sit with military and defense, and a lot of innovation and technology has come through that. And I think that's a great opportunity. Perhaps there's no electric chargers there, but perhaps there's researchers, there's R&D and testing somewhere in the defense sector, which will come up with the next technology that will help us sort some of these problems. So that's an optimistic answer.
Thank you. Any other?
No, I think that.
Great.
Hi. Can I?
Cristina wanted to put
Can I?
that in.
Brilliant.
So, yeah,
Yes,
sorry,
please,
not
Cristina.
ask a question. Okay.
Hi there. Sorry, I think it's a fantastic question, and I'd like to actually compliment, my colleagues, comments on that, because I think you are actually touching one of the biggest challenges faced by SACYR today, including, how should we position ourselves with regards to, ESG corporate strategy, but also where can we get the necessary information in time and quality required. And that leads me to, this reflection. Many organizations spend more time defending past decisions rather than improving their future decisions. So in fact, they waste a lot of money defending past flawed decisions. So our focus should be to contrast assumptions for improving future decisions. So we got another key question today. What shapes the future of our business? And I would say your strategic plan, the needs and expectations of your capital providers, including all forms of capital, financial, human capital, customers, etc., and of course the industry itself. So this framework provides us with the parameters that we use within our decision-making model as a business. So based on these parameters, a good risk management system should actually, notify or alert decision makers as soon as the business is above a risk threshold. So a good risk management system needs to combine quantitative and qualitative analysis. And I think that you have actually raised a question on, one of the biggest risks that nobody is actually talking about, which is the lack of leadership and culture failure. And the failure of leaders refers to the risk that leaders have the wrong data to take decisions, to make decisions, but also the wrong motivations and incentives. And the risk that those motivations, other than the common good of the enterprise, are driving executives to allow excess short-termism and, in the worst cases, not the right behaviors. But this goes beyond leadership and leads us to the what I call the cultural risk. And what is this? We have all heard about the importance of the tone at the top, the fact that the culture of an organization is largely determined by its leaders setting the parameters for business strategy, business plans, and performance incentives. But leaders set the tone not necessarily by what they say, but by what they do. And we know that culture trumps compliance and strategy every day of the week. So culture and how we do things is way more important than written policies and beautifully printed, posters of values. So the general employee population all around the world will act in accordance with the incentives they are given and the culture they perceive, rather than are told about, So these are material and critical for any organization. And for example, younger generations are pushing organizations to have a robust speak-up culture within their organization that allows for problems to rise to the top rather than be suppressed at all levels, as well as a balance and traceable performance and incentive structures, or a code of conduct program that is not a toothless tiger, that is properly researched, positioned, and measured. So I think the lack of leadership and culture failure are systemic risks with devastating consequences if it's not managed and prevented accordingly. And that's why boards need to look out for this and develop checks and balances on the risk of leadership and culture risk. And this is also ESG related.
Fantastic. What a fascinating question, fascinating responses. Dan, do we have time for any more? Yeah. Excellent. Any other questions? Yes, please. There's two people at the back over there.
Sam Brandon at EY. Just quite a simple question. If you had to put a percentage chance on it, what's the percentage that you think on our current trajectory we can stay below 1.5 degrees? And actually, as risk managers, should we be focusing more on dealing with the consequences than trying to prevent climate change?
Okay. Should we keep it brief and ask everybody, what's your percentage chance and how much would you focus on adaptation rather than anything else? Joe, can we start with you?
Very low, and no, I wouldn't focus on adaptation. I would change very low to much higher.
John?
It's around about, so the IPCC scientists are saying it's roughly about 50% in the next 5 years that will exceed on average 1.5 degrees of warming. So that's really disappointing because obviously we're trying to aim for 2050 for that. But I think to answer your question, should we stop worrying about that? No, we should keep up the mitigation of greenhouse gas, the efforts to do that, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, for all the good reasons that are not just about climate, but also creating resilience in the, and having a low cost and resilient power generating sector and all the rest of it. And then I think the other thing about adaptation, absolutely, at the COP this year, this last couple of weeks, adaptation has been right at the top of the agenda. I think it's super important for all societies to build in resilience, and certainly in my sector, in the insurance sector, that's something that we live and breathe. Cristina, please.
Okay. I would say probably, 50% of 50%, because that's the pessimistic scenario, which basically means ESG is becoming mainstream, but more slowly. And if we move into the optimistic scenario, we would be probably saying 80% of the assets are allocated to ESG by 2025. And ESG is, the mainstream across all asset classes. But I would actually stick to the pessimistic scenario, as the lack of data availability and consistency deters investors' ability to adequately assess ESG risks. That's my personal opinion on this.
Thank you. Cvete?
I would say it's probably less likely than it is likely to stick to 1.5 degrees trajectory, but I would not be giving my clients good advice if I said don't focus on adaptation. I think it's important to plan for both, to have also try to adapt in case we don't end up with the 1.5 degrees. So I would say try for both.
So I'll stick with the science. So John's reference to the IPCC 50%, I think is as good as we know for now. But I think in terms of where we focus, adaptation is absolutely key, and in particular, as we've discussed, it's the theme of the COP that's currently ongoing. Adaptation in the global south is going to be absolutely critical. And maybe just a word on what's going to enable that. I think we're going to hear more and more about blended finance. So this is where public or state actors combine with private sector finance to enable these kinds of adaptation projects, which often flounder because of political risk, technology risk, currency risk. These are things that a sort of blended finance framework can help solve, and I think that a lot of focus is going to be on that.
Brilliant, thank you. There was another question, this gentleman here. Vicky, there's a question just there.
Rodrigo Souza, University of Southampton, and co-chair of the Innovation SIG. I was thinking actually about what has been said and done in terms of ESG, and we see that there is acceleration in terms of sustainability, but what a company is not doing and what can be done, because when we think about circular economy, sustainability and governance and all the investments in this area, is still a significant small percentage of the mindset and the resources that companies are actually deploying in R&D and all kinds of developments in this area. Have we actually thought about changing the mindset of business from efficiency-driven economy to a more resilient economy? That's the proposition of this long-term ESG and sustainability discourse. And what risk management can do in that regard?
Thank you. So an efficiency to sustainability mindset. Cristina, can I ask you, is it a mindset or is it a governance issue, or is it both?
All right. Well, I might say that all companies, probably start this journey looking at regulation. So first question, I would say, first challenge faced by SACYR comes into ESG regulation. So they might be probably, questioning themselves. Are we compliant with existing and upcoming ESG regulation across all the relevant jurisdictions? This is first thing, I think, in this journey. And as the, maturity, of the, I would say, risk governance of the company evolves in time, then probably the company gets into, the strategic vision of ESG, shifting the question into how should we position ourselves with regards to ESG corporate strategy. And once, you got the answer on that, then, biggest challenges arise on, ESG data. Where can we get the necessary information in time and quality required? With operations, asking what does all that mean for our, production process? Then customers, or capital providers, expectations, are at the working desk, and this is basically, related to what are our capital providers, financial capital, talent. I would say our human capital, customers, what are our clients, our customers, our investors expecting from us? And then it comes, risk management, risk governance, looking at, how can we ensure ESG is integrated across the entire value chain, and how can we actually deal with decarbonization objectives, as well as the other, ESG challenges within the company. So I think it is a journey which normally starts looking at regulation, then moves into, the strategic vision of ESG, and ends up into the, biggest challenges faced by, by the organization in terms of operations, ESG data, ESG risks. What are my major risks and how can I mitigate them? I don't know if this answers your question.
It seems like a pretty good answer to me. But any other questions, comments? Or yes,
maybe
Nick.
just add to what Cristina was saying. So I think really good that Cristina, you raised the concept of value chain or supply chain, which it's odd that we haven't actually mentioned yet, because that is a huge risk facing corporates. And we've already seen that, so to answer your question, do we need to move from a sort of more growth-focused to a more resilient-focused economy? I think the answer is yes, and I think we are already seeing that in the supply chain. We've moved from the sort of just-in-time concept to building resilience, because corporates have no choice, so absolutely.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yes, please, at the front. Vicky will just come down.
Hi, Caroline Woolley from Meaden and Moore. just a point going back to the percentage and likelihood of reaching net zero and the targets. I was at the OEC conference recently, Onshore Energy Conference in London, and there was a lot of discussion about carbon capture, actually, and that you do have to do both. We continue with the same trajectory in terms of effort, but it's not going to be achieved without carbon capture, innovation and investment to make sure that they're actually talking about putting it back under the North Sea using existing technology and infrastructure and putting it into a liquid form where it becomes less dangerous. But I just wanted, from an energy perspective, you talked about don't let a good crisis go to waste, and it's looking at the opportunities from this and that innovation that, but yeah, being realistic, I'm afraid, has to come into it about what can be achieved, but there are other methods to help us achieve it.
Thank you. So I think big sources of innovation and carbon capture. Where do we think the innovation is going to come to our rescue?
So this device, no government said, okay, generate a smartphone. That was a bunch of clever technologists who thought this is a really good idea. And by the way, it completely changed the world, didn't it? Because the people who are at the top of the Fortune 500 now, making a lot of money, run business models that just are not possible without the smartphone and all the things like social media that it enables. So I think innovation is deeply built into business. It's not governments that drive innovation. Now, the caveat to that, I would say, is in these long-term risks, so going back to the question about long-termism, is that, if you take, for example, the last crisis of the most recent poly-crisis, if you like, the pandemic, the deployment or the generation of vaccines and the deployment of vaccines was an amazing success. Normally it takes 20 years to create a vaccine. We did it in about a year globally. And how did that happen? It happened because some very smart people from private equity background actually sort of kind of set the opportunity that let's do lots of these things. Let's create 100 opportunities, get the pharma industry and the biotech industry to think of all those opportunities. 3 might work. Fine, it doesn't matter about the other 97 that don't, but let's get the 3 that work. And then let's get the government to put the money behind the scaling up of the production and then the distribution, the equitable distribution of those vaccines. Now that works really well when governments do the things they're good at and organise that kind of thing and let business go and do the things they're good at. And I think that's going to be the hallmark of the changes that are going to drive a successful transition to a net zero economy. Because if you think about it, where we're going at the moment, especially in Europe with the sustainable finance taxonomy, it smacks a lot of, well, I think you should have this type of smartphone or this type of video recording, beta versus VHS and all this kind of stuff. It's like, let the market decide, let them go and figure it out, create diversity, which is so important in building resilience in almost any sector. So I think, that's the hallmark of what's going to change. The one final point I want to make on this is to get to net zero, if you look at the CDP and Science Based Targets Initiative sort of classification of the 3 things you need to do to get to net zero. Number 1 is abatement. Reduce emissions in all sectors, in all processes and products and services. That's the focus for the next 10 years, to try and halve emissions by 2030. Enormously difficult task. That's what everyone has to be focused on. If we can't do that, we're into not the low or no overshoot scenario that the IPCC scientists were talking about 5 years ago. We're going to overshoot. So what are we going to do to net zero? Well, we've got to do what's called neutralization in the CDP, SBTI terminology. That's coming back to Caroline's point. We've got to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it somewhere. Now, you can either do that with photosynthesis, so it's afforestation or reforestation or those kinds of things, or protecting carbon sinks. Like forest, boreal or tropical forests, or use technological processes like bioenergy CCS or DACS, direct air capture CCS. That's different, by the way, from the CCS most people talk about, which is an abatement issue. That's abating, it's taking carbon dioxide from industrial processes and then storing it deep underground. But there's got to be a very interesting opportunity and discussion, I think, underpinned by this third part of getting to net zero, which is what people term as compensation. Doesn't mean giving money to people. It means financing both abatement and neutralisation. And that's essentially the world of carbon credits, whether it's compliance schemes like the ETS or generally run by governments, regulated schemes where they set thresholds for emissions, or it's the voluntary carbon markets. And there it's all about trying to get high-quality projects that underpin the financial instruments, which are the carbon credits. So I think all of that has to work together. And my very last comment on this is going to be about geoengineering. I'm really concerned about geoengineering, because I think what will happen is, as the world really warms and people in the most vulnerable parts of the world really suffer, there's going to be a great desire to do things like injecting aerosols into the atmosphere to try and shade and cool the planet. Iron filings chucked into the ocean to try and fertilize the oceans to get algae to grow and then absorb more carbon dioxide. Disaster from a nature point of view. I mean, playing with the planet's natural systems in that way could lead to some highly dystopian futures, which could be existential for all of us. So at the moment, there's a shout out here for the Carnegie Institute, who are trying to actually put together or influence governments to put together some governance around geoengineering. And I think that's extremely important, because that's a case where innovation could actually go bad.